On Monday, January 5th, 1931, 34-year-old Mack Elliott died on the Lincoln Highway in Ohio. Now, who Mack Elliott was and what happened to him in Elizabethton, Tennessee 2 years earlier is the subject of our story this week. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, A History of Appalachia.
Once again, we go back to Upper East Tennessee, so to speak, Steve, and we look at where this story kind of, I guess, does it originate or kind of start and begin to take place in Elizabethton?
Oh, it's all in Elizabethton, to be honest with you. Actually, we've talked about the big outline of this. This happened during the rayon strikes, the textile strikes, back in 1929 in Elizabethton at their two rayon plants. And this is one of those events that happened during that strike.
Wow. Okay.
All right. Well, in the spring of 1929, Elizabethton, Tennessee was the site of a work stoppage at those two very large rayon plants, American Bemberg and American Glanstoff. Now, the strikes at these plants, along with similar strikes at textile plants across the Southeast, were over low wages, increased quotas, and petty workplace regulations, among other things. Now, workers would stage strike parades to display not only their grievances, but also their patriotism. And as you can imagine, there were those in Elizabethton and Carter County who weren't very happy about the situation, and some of them were determined to do something about it.
Well, one of those striking workers was Mack Elliott, who worked at the Bamberg Glanstoff plants as a mechanical foreman. Elliott lived with his wife and children in a house in the Stony Creek section of Carter County, Tennessee. Now, his house was built of concrete blocks covered with stucco and was considered to be one of the nicest houses in the area. That spring, he was out on strike with the other plant workers, making ends meet by working as an auto mechanic in Elizabethton until the workers and the company could reach an agreement. Now, normally we tell you in our own words what happened next, but by sheer luck, we've managed to find an account of this story told by none other than Mack Elliott himself. Apparently, Mack, like many other working class people back during that time, flirted with a little idea called Marxism, and he wrote of the incident in a Marxist publication called Labor Age. So we're going to share parts of that with you, leaving out the politics, though, of the piece.
On one beautiful May morning, I was awakened by the sudden jingle of the alarm clock, which told me it was time for me to commence getting my aching limbs moving once more for another 12-hour shift to provide means for my family to have food and shelter. To have this home I work for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and caustic soda so strong one single drop meant blindness the rest of your life. These were part of the conditions out of which I tried to rend a living in Happy Valley.
Well, he goes on to describe the start of the strike and the violence that accompanied it, including the kidnapping of union leaders and the appearance of one of the leaders of the United Textile Workers of America, a man named Dr. William F. Kelly, who he looked up to, even though Kelly was ridiculed as the quote unquote scum of Moscow and, quote, the hatred of hell, end quote. Obviously, things were pretty heated during this time. Mr. Elliott continues.
Came the troops, sent to protect us and our property. Thinking all was well, I went to attend the parade on the streets and a night meeting afterwards. And as all seemed to be going well, there was a great explosion, and in a few minutes, I received the news my home was blown to pieces. I rushed to where the home had once been. No home, no money, no friends to pray for me.
Well, thankfully, his wife Nora had been away from the house when the explosion occurred. Now, although the Elliots lost most of their belongings in the explosion, those sturdy concrete blocks were in ruins. A chimney a quarter-mile away was destroyed, and windows shattered throughout Stony Creek. A rooster and the family dog were rescued from the ruins of that once fine house. Must have been a pretty big explosion, Steve.
It was terrible. And by the way, this wasn't the first incident of this kind reported by Mack Elliott. Not long before the explosion, he reported to the Carter County Sheriff's Office that someone, now he didn't know who, had tossed a lit stick of dynamite through his car window as he was headed home from work one evening. He managed to put out the fuse and took the dynamite to the sheriff's office. Now, the blast at the Elliott house was investigated by the state fire marshal, George Barger. Now, for 6 weeks, he investigated the incident, and eventually a man by the name of Jim Bice was arrested for the explosion, which the prosecution contended was planned by Mack Elliott himself, with the help of Jim Bice and another man, Paul Porter. Bice himself had signed a confession, but on the stand he recanted, saying he was forced to sign it by people he was afraid to name.
Well, the jury came back with a finding of not guilty, and that's where the story ends. Well, at least for the explosion, since by that time the strike had been settled and the general feeling was that things needed to get back to normal, so the investigation came to a halt. Now, to be sure, Mack Elliott himself was no angel. Now, in 1926, he and another man, Houston Pierce, had been tried on counterfeiting charges in federal court in Knoxville, but he was acquitted. And the summer after the explosion, Mack appeared in Carter County Criminal Court on a charge of transporting liquor.
But, Rod, the incident in Elizabethton appears to have been the last straw for Elliott, for he soon moved to Pennsylvania to take a job as mechanical foreman for the Sun Oil Company later in 1929. On January 5th, 1931, he was driving on the Lincoln Highway near Chambersburg, Ohio at about 2 p.m. According to his nephew, Brown Elliott, Mack was in a hurry to get back home. It had been raining, and when they passed a car on a curve, they collided head-on with another car. Mack suffered a crushed skull in the accident and died 20 minutes later. He was buried in the Ritchie Cemetery near the Baptist Church in Winter, Tennessee, near his family. So there you go. A sad ending to a very odd story. I mean, they still to this day don't know who set that explosion for sure.
Well, it's interesting. It kind of reminds me sometimes of the old miners' strike, so to speak. The violence and things that went on. I've always heard of explosives and different things, but in this case, the description of it, how it blew up, and then trying to link him to all these different things or trying to link someone else to these things, all of it did kind of, well, I can say reek a little bit of the labor movement, or at least labor politics. But, like you said, all this comes together and comes to a head really at 2 p.m. on January 5th, 1931 on that road near Chambersburg, Ohio.
Indeed it does. And folks, that's the story of the explosion that ripped apart Mack Elliott's house, the cause of which is a mystery to this day. And another part of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to the Stories podcast at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Audible, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, or on your very own favorite podcast app. Until next we meet. So long, everybody.
So long.